It's a joy to be here with all of you. Part of my experience of traveling and speaking is the opportunity of meeting so many friends whom I've never laid eyes on before, but friends, some of whom I've met because they commented on the blog or shared a thought with through email, or simply show up as people who have read it and it kept me encouraged to keep writing. I really appreciate that, and especially people who've shared personal stories of things that were helpful to them. I'll clarify that story about the young lady in my parish. Somewhere or another in a class, I was talking about having been a Jesus freak. So I do admit to being a Jesus freak, and I'm still proud to be one. But she had never heard the term. It just tells you how young she was. And so she went home and looked up Jesus freak on Wikipedia, and I had no idea, but down towards the bottom of the article, it mentioned me and some things like that, and I'm thinking, I don't know who the heck wrote this thing, but this is not correct. So, but I survived all of that. There was a major research paper in 2015 that reached conclusions that were carried in a wide range of news sources across the world, and this was the news. Orthodox Christians, this is the way the thing read, are the least happy of all religious groups. Our patron saint, that cat thing, died this week, and whatever that was on all those memes, but they're the least happy of all religious groups. They're less happy than Catholics, Protestants, Buddhists, Muslims, and Hindus, according to this study. And they tend to prefer jobs that are safe and are more supportive of state involvement in the economy. Lo and behold, the study, it was authored by two Bulgarian social scientists, one of them working in London, but it was like an international thing. They did all of this research. So in a conference with the title of Growing in the Likeness, I thought it would be useful to begin by noting how poorly the Eastern tradition is at growing into the likeness of late 20th and early 21st century consumer capitalism. The Eastern tradition of the church is decidedly unmodern and seems to be a major factor in holding people back from getting on the gravy train of the happiness caravan. And so maybe that's why it's going over so well in the South. We've been unhappy for a long time. So, but Russians are wonderful, but you hear stories there of the woman coming to her priest and saying, "Father, God does not love me anymore." And he says, "What's wrong?" He said, "Your husband is healthy." He goes, "He's wonderful." He said, "Your children in school?" She goes, "He's wonderful." He said, your farm?" She goes, "He's wonderful." He says, "So what is it?" She says, "We're not suffering. God has forgotten us." So maybe that's who they had in this survey. My oldest daughter in the year 2000 she was majoring in Russian at the University of Alabama. That should draw a laugh, but anyway. But, and so she took a year abroad and to study in Russia, and she decided to go to Krasnoyarsk, which is in deep Siberia, 12 time zones on the other side of the world from the Eastern time zone here in the U.S. And when the Russians in our parish said, "Почему Siberia? Why are you going to Siberia?" She said, "Well, I want to go somewhere where they don't speak much English, so I'll just be learning Russian." And they said, "Yes." She said, "This is awful." She said, "And I want to learn how to live." And the Russian said to me, "Your daughter, she has Russian soul." So I'll say here at the outset that when the conference is over and you're not feeling happy, we will have succeeded to a certain degree. All right? I'm sorry, but we're laughing too much. So when you read articles announcing results like that, the mind sort of reels. I mean, a lot of people out there on the internet were rushing to say, "But I am happy." We wonder rightly, though, how do you measure happiness? mean, the question of the link between religion and happiness actually had its beginnings in the work of Max Weber, one of the fathers of sociology, around the early 20th century, 1904 or so, I think his major study was. He was the inventor of the famous notion called the Protestant work ethic. He was German. You can do the math. Not from southern Germany. Anyway, this is a shorthand version of the happiness thesis. It would read like this, that the individualism in free market capitalism generally makes people more prosperous, which is true. It does tend to create wealth. It's undeniable. And the Protestants are better suited ideologically to participate in a wholehearted manner with this free market individualism, which is apparently also true. I mean, after all, they have... religion is an entrepreneurial activity among them. Protestants are happier on these scales, and that's also true. If happiness is equated with the measurements generated by modern economic models. Yeah? So in Weber's day, one of the famous conclusions was that Catholic countries were less prosperous than Protestant countries, meaning England, Holland, and Germany. They were less prosperous because they were lazy and had a poor work ethic. That especially applied to southern Mediterranean types. These stereotypes still prevail. I mean, the discussions a few years ago about Greece wanting to go, and they're Orthodox, but they were just like, they're like Italians, but they're only Greek, but, they like to eat, and the Spanish like to sleep too much, and the French want vacations, 7 weeks. So there was this Protestant work ethic and a great deal of prejudice that went along with it. And so today, the poor man of Europe is the Eastern Europeans, and it's possible if you're in prosperous northern Western Europe to blame them for their poverty. It's because of their orthodoxy. What they need is, they need some freedom. America, we're here to bring it for you. So perhaps the first question tonight in this talk, when we speak of growing in the likeness of God, is which God do we mean? The answer to the question is actually probably the greatest question of our age, for it's the teaching of the faith that we are created in the image and likeness of God, so that when we speak of the identity of God, we're also speaking of the identity of human beings. The worship of a false God is also the creation of a false humanity. So this is the very heart of our faith, that salvation consist in the knowledge of the true God and of union with Him, and that the true God is made known to us in the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is our faith. And somehow, all of that ought to be obvious among Christians, but it's not. I mean, in fact, far from it. In the South of my childhood, several people have been commenting to me this evening that I don't have much of a Southern dialect, and I apologize. I have too much learning, and but the South of my childhood, the word salvation was common, and it had a clear meaning in public speech. Human beings were sinners, we understood that, who deserved eternal punishment. And salvation meant accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and thereby we were saved from eternal punishment. I mean, there were signs, it's still there in the South, just, repent or burn, and the flip or fry signs along the side of the road, and billboards of various sorts. So what was the problem from which you needed to be saved? Salvation's being saved. What was the problem you needed to be saved from? The answer was simple. It was hell. Hell was the problem. So when I was about 13 years old, I committed my first act of blasphemy. I was raised a Baptist, and I didn't go to church much. but I did get the hell thing. I did learn that. But doing the math about this salvation, it occurred to me one day, I remember exactly where I was standing. I was with a friend in his living room. It occurred to me at age 13 that if God would just relax, everyone could be saved. And so I shook my fist at him and said, if you're going to send some folks to hell, then I don't want to go to heaven. It's not nice. I did, as I said, it was an act of blasphemy. I didn't realize it was also an act of theology. I didn't realize I was confronting the problems created by the penal substitutionary atonement theory. Well, that would have sounded fancy. But there was nothing sophisticated about my teenage analysis, just emotion and primitive logic. I could have been told, which I was later, but God cannot deny his justice. But I would have concluded then that God must be really having a hard time with things, and it would not have convinced me. And so I have to say, when people talk about their backgrounds, I was never a Christian who subscribed to that. It made no sense to me, and so I quit for a couple of years. But my first conclusion today, a proposition, if you will, is that whatever the problem is that needs saving, the problem is within us. It's not the arrangement of the universe, and it's not in some sort of a metaphysical straitjacket that limits God. Now, I would like to save you, but no, that does not work. So what is sin? So what is it that needs to be saved? And the rest of this evening, I will largely be working from St. Gregory of Nyssa. And I do that not because he's the only father, but the fathers themselves called him, St. Maximus the Confessor, and the fathers of the Seventh Council called him the Father of Fathers. That's pretty good. And they said that because he's simply an exemplar. He represents the heart and mind of the church. Even when St. Gregory says things that causes problems, such as his teaching on the apokatastasis, that is the restitution of all things, even when he does that, he does it with an Eastern mind. You cannot say of him, you're not an Eastern father, you're not Orthodox. I've often thought the same thing about Tolstoy. He died outside the church and said some odd things, and so he's frequently wrong, but he's always Russian when he's wrong. He's wrong in a Russian way. And so, that was even true of the communists. The communists, they were wrong about a lot of things, but one of the things they kept was actually the grammar of orthodoxy. So they still had processions with great big pictures. They just had pictures of the wrong guy, And, they did not get rid of the procession with the birch branches for the Feast of Pentecost. They just made a secular holiday called the Day of Trees. So when the Soviet Union fell, people just changed the pictures out, and it's been, they've averaged 3 churches a day being built since 1991, 30,000 churches, 1,000 monasteries. Somebody said to me, it's just because they like Putin. And I'm thinking, they got 1,000 monasteries. You don't give up sex, drugs, and rock and roll because you like a politician. I know. So, anyway, wrong in a Russian way. So, Nyssa, even if he was wrong on anything, which is an interesting question, if he was wrong in anything, he was wrong in a very orthodox way. Say that. He says this. I hope this is not going to be too thick. And I'm actually working a lot from Balthasar, great Catholic theologian, one of the best readers of Nyssa and of Dionysius and Maximus, really great someone to touchstone. Nyssa says everything that exists outside of God is like nothing before his eyes. Not absolutely nothing, but like nothing, like a spider's web, so that he who looks at it sees nothing. And all of this is suspended in God in order to be able to subsist or to exist. It participates in the inexhaustible source of being. This is the ground of our being, that we're created in God. He sustains the universe. I mean, the notion of the deist, that God was the watchmaker who kind of created the world, wound it up, and walked away from it, is like as un-Eastern a concept as is possible. In Him we live and move and have our being. I say Eastern. When I say that, you should understand Christian. But, sorry. I mean, this is the New Testament is an Eastern book. It just is. As I say, for heaven's sakes, it was written in Greek. But he continues on. He said, but if we turn away from this source with a desire to belong to ourselves, it no longer merits the name of being. This profoundly ontological privation of being is sin. And the idea that you can have an existence apart from God is actually what secularism is. It is the heart of the modern world. There's God, maybe, if you want one, whatever you think, and it, floats your boat. But this is just, we live in a neutral zone. We've got that two-story universe thing going, and God, He's welcome to visit if He wants to, but He should not interfere with us, much less our rights. This insight is shared by St. Athanasius and most of the later fathers of the East. It's certainly in the earlier ones. Sin is death. Sin is death. Simple. Sin is death. We were created to exist and to move towards well-being, finally to eternal being. This triad runs throughout, particularly the Cappadocian fathers. To exist, to have being, to move to well-being, to eternal being. This is a movement deeper and deeper in towards God. But we broke communion with the Lord and giver of life, and so we fall back towards non-being. We don't just suddenly cease to exist. We start moving back towards non-being. Sin and death are a movement and a direction, which is one of the reasons why the word for sin, harmatia, means to miss the mark. What we need is a mid-course correction. Be moving back towards being. So the first point on this that I want to make regarding the problem from which we need to be saved is that it's not a moral problem. We do not have a legal problem. St. Isaac of Syria wrote, had all of this astounding affair, by which he means Jesus and the cross, death and resurrection, had all of this astounding affair taken place solely for the purpose of the forgiveness of sin, it would have been sufficient to redeem us by some other means. Like, as if there was no forgiveness in the Old Testament. There was. It's clear. Happens all the time. It was not a legal problem. So, the cure suggested by the legal models of atonement simply don't fit the disease. It's not the problem. I thought to myself, just being here in Seattle, which is an interesting city. We don't have one of those in Tennessee yet, although I think the entire country's kind of moving this way. But this is one of the most moral cities in all of America. It's very moral. In fact, I would suggest that the more secular you become, the more moral you tend to be. You can negotiate with a Christian, but don't try negotiating with a secularist. It's can be. We were talking yesterday about smoking, and Sean said, we were out down towards the wharf or whatever you call that area, was the shops are. He said, if you lit up a joint here, people would probably say, could you kind of step aside also with that? I don't like the smell of it. He said, but if I lit up a cigar here, they would attack me and, haul me off, have the police arrest me. Highly moral. Pot's good, cigar's bad. So this week. So the problem of our lives and of all of creation is utterly a matter of life and death. we are moving away from God towards non-being. We could say that we're held captive, which is the church's language, we are held captive by sin and death. The church is a hospital for sinners, not a courthouse. Not a courthouse. And, people see and read. Of course, in our culture, we will read legal language into the Scriptures when it's not there. So that any language that can be interpreted as a courtroom will get read into it. I've got some Reformed friends who are constantly trying to teach me about the courtroom. And I'm just thinking, it's anachronistic. You're talking about a late Western model of the law that did not exist then. If you read the word law in the New Testament and you think it means what Luther thought it means, you're wrong. He just didn't. And it's very good to read things in their proper context. So, in my second talk tomorrow, I'll speak about the problems of modernity for Christians, but I want to note at this point that much of what we see as problematic in the modern world has been created by a distortion of Christianity. And modernity is a Christian heresy. It just is. We invented it. We could talk about how that happened. It was an accident. Nobody meant to do it, but we did it. It's ours. We need to, and we're exporting it. But many of those in the modern world would say, for instance, that they don't believe in God. My response is always, tell me about the God you don't believe in. I'll bet I don't believe in that one either. Modernity imagines that Christianity offers a juridical God. They don't believe in him for good reason. He doesn't exist. There is no juridical God. Also, they have rejected the moral teaching of the church for the very reason that the juridical reasoning taught to them oftentimes in the name of the church has led them to their present immoral conclusions. Gosh, I'll just get dangerous here, but we're filming this. One of the difficulties we had in America when the discussion came up several years ago about the question of same-sex unions or same-sex marriage as a legal it was framed as a legal question. And since most people in America conceived of marriage as a contract, that's very much you made a promise, he made a promise. Except in the Eastern Church, there are no vows in a wedding. We just tie them up, give them a drink, and walk them around in a circle, and then let them go. But seems to work. But yeah, so yeah, but the divorce rate among Greek Orthodox is among the lowest in the nation. But I've also heard it's because if you bring up the subject, they'll all get together and hound you until you stop saying that. So it takes a whole village to stay married sometimes. But in our culture, we thought of it as a contract. And how can any two people not make a contract with each other? Well, of course any two people can make a contract with each other. That's a no-brainer. And that's sort of how the court had to come down, because the court had the language of a morality that was a contract, legal kind of morality. The Orthodox argument about all of that is that you can do these illegal arrangements all you want to, but it's an ontological arrangement that we speak of when we speak of a union between husband and wife. And the fruit of that union is bone of their bone and flesh of their flesh, X of their X and Y of their Y, or XX, or however that goes. It's a child. Babies running around. And God bless you. Only unions make babies. Real unions. And I know they're working on that to try to get the science to catch up with the theory, but it's only unions that do that. And I offer no ridicule for anybody, but it's like we have this conversation in which we're missing each other. The tradition of the church speaks ontologically. The true tradition and the depth of the tradition of the church speaks ontologically, that is, in matters of being. But it has for too long spoke legally and taught the culture to speak legally. And you cannot derive Christian belief, Christian living, and how we live as Christians based on legal thinking. It won't get there. It never works. It fails. There's an emptiness to it, and sometimes even a 13-year-old can see it. And they reject it. You know, Father Thomas Hopko of blessed memory once said, many times it takes grace to be an atheist. He said, because the grace at work is the rejection of a false God. I've said to sometimes people that I've met that are inquiring in faith and visit my church that you might need to become an atheist before I can make you Orthodox, because we got to get rid of this guy you think is God. He's not going to fit very well. Not here. You have to work on that. So this is a difficult thing of getting free from false things so that we can understand. I mean, it's really only in this matter of being that we can truly understand love and mercy. But what does the problem of sin and death, that is the journey towards non-existence, what does it look like? In our culture, it looks like the pursuit of life, that is the good life, the lifestyle. What we call life is the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure. You know? That's why money works so good. We've got a crisis of the absence of pain in Appalachia. It's called opioids. It's spreading everywhere else too. But you know, that model doesn't work. It's the absence of pain, the presence of pleasure. We refuse to suffer in the right way, and we wind up making people suffer in the wrong way. You know, every time they accuse me of kind of being scary in wedding homilies, because I will boldly tell the couple that, you know, well, we've got martyr crowns on them, and I'll explain what that's about. I did an article several years ago on the blog, and for some reason or other it was very popular, but it was called Marriage is Lifelong Suffering. And husbands were sending it to their wives, and wives were sending it to their husbands, and it was very popular out there. It was also true. It's true. I mean, if you want to get married, love is, Jesus says, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Love means suffering. It's good suffering. It's suffering that's worth doing. In fact, I would say nobody knows how to live unless they know how and why to suffer. First off, you can't not suffer. You can't. Is that good English? No, it's not. No, sorry. Dialect. It's good Appalachian. You cannot not suffer. Suffering is inevitable. And if you don't do it well, and there is a doing it well, I've seen it. I spent 2 years as a hospice chaplain out in the mountains of Tennessee. I saw some really fine Christians, Baptists and Pentecostals, who suffered like they were in Siberia. I mean, they were just holy people who lived. I remember watching a woman on her deathbed just whispering, and she had her hands up in the air, and I thought, oh, she's having one of those kind of morphine hallucinations or whatever. I leaned over to see what she was saying, and she was just saying, praise you, Jesus. Praise you, Jesus. Glory to you. She was in an absolute Pentecostal ecstasy, moving on. Moving on. You know, how did she suffer? She suffered with glory and with thanks to the crucified Jesus, who she had united herself with him and was taking her through this valley of the shadow and taking her home. So, a word I like to use to describe this movement of sin and death is disintegration. Things fall apart. We do not create beauty. We don't promote true being. We're becoming a shallow people. Stanley Hauerwas at Duke has said that contemporary Christianity is so empty it cannot even produce interesting atheists. It's true. The very heart of the Christian tradition is not simply that we're made in the image and likeness of God, but that the crucified Jesus is the revelation of the image and likeness according to which we were and are created. The Scripture says the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the earth. The revelation of God. Jesus on the cross is not just a sideshow of God doing a rescue operation. Jesus on the cross is the fullness of the revelation of God. The fullness of the revelation of God. So Paul will say, I have determined to know and to preach among you Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This is the gospel. This is the image according to which we are created. This is the glory of God. John makes it clear in his gospel. When I am glorified means when I am lifted up. On the cross I will draw all men to myself. The face of Jesus, in the face of Jesus, we see the face of our own true self. And we've been told that even though we do not yet see it clearly, we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, John says, for we will see Him as He is. So the second thing I'll focus on in this talk is salvation itself. If the problem is sin and death, then what does salvation look like? It's a movement. If sin is a movement towards death and non-existence, what does a movement towards life and true being look like? I'll quote Nissa again. The journey towards salvation is marked by a successive elimination of all that we have in order to reach what we are. The elimination of what we have in order to reach what we are. He says the safest path and the surest refuge is not to be deluded and to fail to recognize ourselves. That is, to fail to recognize who we truly are. We should not believe that we are seeing ourselves when we're only seeing something that surrounds us, our body, our senses, or the ideas that others have of us. He says, for anything unstable, that is, anything that is changing, is not us. The soul, he says, is purified in this way as she lays aside garment after garment after garment after garment. So the ideal of salvation will appear as that supreme instant wherein the soul, having laid aside all of her corporeal veils, presents herself naked and pure in spirit to the vision of God in a divine vigil. I kind of read this a paragraph at a time, and then I sit there and think, whoa. My goodness. The movement towards God, which is salvation, is also a movement towards the true self. And this is utterly and completely removed from every possible notion of a juridical relationship. When I'm teaching the faith to newcomers, among the things I stress is that in the work of salvation, that is theosis, divinization, we're not only becoming God, we're also becoming truly human. This is very important. The faith that is given to us in the tradition is the living memory of what it means to be human. You know, someone says you're a traditionalist. I think you have no choice. The whole dang thing has been handed down to you. I've told this story before. You may have seen it in a YouTube talk or whatever. My wife, we had our first child in 1980. She was an advanced woman, and she wanted to breastfeed. Now, some of you will be amazed to know that in 1980 that was uncommon. Probably in Seattle it was happening all over, but not, not in. We were in Chicago. The child was born in South Carolina, and oddly enough, my mama and her mama, who were mamas in the 50s, had been told by the medical profession that science now knows. I love it when they say things like that. We now know that, and they had this formula stuff. I don't know if Nestle was making it back then or not, but anyway, we've got this formula stuff, and it's going to be better for your children. And Beth had begun to read some subversive literature, and wanted to breastfeed the child, and our first child was born, and her nursing reflex had not quite developed yet. She was born early, and things weren't working. Mama wasn't happy, baby wasn't happy. That is not a happy home. And I was despairing, she's just not, it's your first child, and I don't know anything. And, but I just know that it's not happy. And somehow or another, my wife discovered a thing called La Leche League. like an underground movement of women who were remembering how to be women. And 2 women came to our house, our apartment, and in 8 hours taught our baby, who was less than 2 weeks old, how to nurse. I didn't know you could do that. But it dawned on me that almost any village in Africa had at least a half dozen women who did know that, because we've been nursing since we were porpoises. I mean, or something like that. I don't know. It sounded like a good line. But I mean, imagine the medical profession trying to tell mammals, think of the meaning of the word, not to nurse. What is that? This is modernity at its very heart. It forgot what it was to be human. I mean, some of this isn't really hard. It's just we've been doing it forever. It's, and sometimes we get it wrong and we go through a few centuries of legalism and there's problems about that. But I mean, this memory of what it is to be human. So I tell our people coming to the church that in this Eastern tradition that is being kept, there's simply a memory of what it is to be human as we were taught in Jesus Christ. And that, yes, I mean, being a traditionalist doesn't mean that you've got to say the Mass this particular way or something like that. It means that you understand that your life was handed down to you. You did not create yourself. I have to ask if, Jonathan, were you born speaking French? Oh. You do speak French. He's Québécois. Yeah, he's a French Canadian. We always joked about that people say, I didn't want to baptize my child. We wanted to wait and let them make their mind up. And I'm thinking, well, we didn't teach our child any language. We wanted to wait and see if perhaps they were French, I mean, people say things like that. And I'm thinking, well, are you going to wait on that potty training too? What is it? What is it about being human you don't understand? Of course you teach your children. Who else is going to tell them about God? Wait till they're going to find out about it. That's silliness. Of course you tell them, and you try to warp them in the way they should go. Gently, with love and care. But, and hopefully that they'll actually have seen enough of Jesus in you that they want to be like him. Because if they don't, there's not a lot of hope. Hauerwas, whom I like to quote a lot because I studied under him at Duke, said on marriage and the family, he said, there's good news and bad news about your children. He said, the good news, despite how worried you are, is that they're likely going to turn out just like you. And he said, and that's the bad news too. So, but a simple way to think of this is Jesus said, whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. That is the soul, the life. It's psyche in the Greek there. It's soul. The soul that we lose is not losing the true self, but everything that encumbers the true self. Everything that obscures the mirror. The soul is a mirror, St. Gregory says again and again. So the ascetics struggle with the passions. Fasting and things like this is not an effort to become what we're not. I'm not trying to become something I'm not. I'm trying to become what I am. So, I think it's just safe to say that this movement is the only true and proper form of humanism. I like to say that Christianity is the original and right humanism. God is a humanist. So all that goes by that name in our modern world, though, is in fact anti-human. An effort to reinvent ourselves into something we never have been nor ever will be. It's the construction of a false self with haywood and stubble that will not survive the fire to come. So this juridical approach to salvation that distorts the Christian vision and reduces it to moralism, I've written in my book, I made the statement that Jesus did not die to make bad men good. Jesus died to make dead men live. Moralism is an approach that seeks to teach corpses to behave. They stink. So after a fashion, a well-behaved corpse is far more dangerous than an obviously misbehaving person. It is, in fact, a whitewashed sepulcher, as Jesus warned about, full of dead men's bones. And I suspect that Jonathan would describe this as the zombie apocalypse. Yeah? So when orthodoxy speaks about theosis, meaning that God became man so that man might become God, we should be wary that it not be confused with the variety of modern projects that seek to build a better world or to build a better human being. Indeed, when theosis is combined with synergy, this cooperation work with God, it can easily sound like the tradition is endorsing some sort of divinization by way of human effort. And frankly, I get this a lot on internet orthodoxy, that people are kind of into the synergy thing and are really crypto-Pelagians, that is, that they're being saved by their will. And mostly what their will makes them is into obnoxious Christians. And, who are out there concerned and policing who you might be speaking to on any given engagement, or other things like that going on. I didn't mean to say that, but I did. This stuff is not hard. It's about love. It's about life. It's about union with God. It's about becoming what in fact you really are. So this is something we have to know and understand, is that, and I'll say more about this in the second talk, but that the whole creation is on our side. People don't know it. Every time somebody's born, they're not born a modernist. They're born a human being. You have to mess them up to make them modern. But they'll have children that are human beings, and it just keeps happening. Generation after generation, we keep producing human beings, and the image of God is absolutely grafted in their soul. Things happen. We've got lots of periods in history. Things go, things come. The Soviet Union, there was 70 years. The church was being stamped out. And suddenly, they were just really thought for certain that it was, gone. Church attendance in the Soviet Union had dropped to the level of France and Scotland. Yes, I had a brother-in-law who went to Romania. He's a Presbyterian, who went to Romania as a missionary. And I said, don't you know that 90% of Romania are Orthodox Christians? I said, why don't you go to Scotland where only 5% go to church and you speak their language? You killed them. You killed them. And you want to go do it to these poor people who've endured for all these years and are just now coming back to life? No, they don't need modernity. They need their humanity. Maximus said, the mystery of the incarnation of the Logos is the key to all symbolism and typology in the Scriptures. That's where Jonathan's going to pick up and run with that. But in addition, he says it gives us knowledge of created things, visible and invisible, and then says, he who apprehends the mystery of the cross and the burial of Christ apprehends the inward essences of created things, while he who is initiated into the inexpressible power of the resurrection apprehends the purpose for which God first established everything. When we stand in church and shout, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, the entire universe agrees with us. The entire universe agrees with us. So if you're ever feeling a little outnumbered, you're looking in the wrong direction. We're in union with God. He has created us for himself, and his image is there. So, when all of this is understood, then the goal and the end for which we're created is understood as well. All of the counterfeit notions of human existence are revealed in their vanity. All of the various projects of humanity, including the many religious projects of Christianity, are unmasked as little more than towers of Babel in disguise. One of the great projects of the early 20th century, it was born out of actually where the ecumenical movement got its beginnings, in meetings in Edinburgh, Scotland, and kind of Protestants getting together, and they were concerned, and they raised up the notion of carrying the gospel to all of the world in a single generation. It was just one more modern project, meaning we must carry the good news of white first world Europe and America to our poor little dark-skinned brothers and sisters in these other continents and give them blue jeans or whatever it was from our culture that we were exporting. And we exported, actually the fun thing is they got the gospel and now they're sending missionaries back, real believing missionaries back to America. I love that. It's just like living in the South. I've always thought the greatest joke in the South was when slave owners gave the scriptures to their slaves to read the book that basically said, God's on the side of the slaves. They thought, oh yeah, go down Moses, way down to Canaan land, and singing, we're all working for the Pharaoh. And they understood that until a modern day prophet and Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of those who are too young to have actually heard him other than a few speeches on YouTube. The man didn't give speeches, the man preached. He preached the gospel of Jesus Christ, constantly filled throughout his speeches. He rarely said anything political. It was religiously based in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think that's why it had particularly the impact in the South that it did. I watched the consciences of my father and his father, who had been a Klansman. I watched it change because they believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ and they heard it preached well and correctly and in the measure that it was understood. But it's all there. It's the fullness of the faith given to us in the Scriptures. So, when we think through human history, even though it is deeply marked by sin, in every conceivable way marked by sin, evil has done terrible things, and yet despite all of that, we're still here. We're not only still here, goodness keeps happening. I've always said it's easy to explain the problem of evil. I can always explain where the evil came from. You just usually only have to go back and do a little family systems study as to how it got there. It's the problem of good you can't explain. How come they keep turning out good? How come people sometimes raised in the most horrible of circumstances become saints? How is that? It's because there is a God, and He loves us, and He has so indelibly created us in His image that all of the evil cannot keep it down. It cannot overcome. Christ tramples down death by death. He renews us day by day and restores us and is restoring us. We should be hopeful. It's scary sometimes, and you can get angry sometimes, but just get over it. Confess that Christ is risen and understand that in His resurrection, the end of history has occurred. It's in the past. The end is in the middle. It's already done. We won. It's okay. So, Christ is risen. Thank you. It's okay to clap. Yeah, please. Yeah, just don't say amen. That's like saying sick 'em to a dog. But so very good. So what happens now?
We're going to do some question and answer.
Okay.
So if you guys have questions, maybe you just raise your hand and Sean and Shane will circulate around and collect them. Father, while we're doing that, I have one question for you. I love how you talked about the modern world And the problem with it is the distortion of Christianity, and because you fall into this legal mindset. And then you talk very beautifully about learning to suffer well. And I'm wondering maybe if you could go into a little bit. This is maybe a whole separate talk, but really, what does the East bring in this attitude of suffering well, suffering joyfully, that could act as maybe an antidote to this problem of legalism that we have, especially in the West?
Well, I think particularly in the ascetical tradition of the church, of fasting, of prayer, of keeping vigil, of that, it's just at the heart of Eastern Christianity that these traditional practices are kept. Many of them were Jewish before they were Christian, and because they knew this too. Those things are voluntary suffering. But I also say that getting married and having children is voluntary suffering too, and it's a great calling. It makes saints if we do it well. But I think that first off, the false notion in modernity that, because it's right, we should try to relieve suffering. Jesus does that. He heals the sick, cleanses the lepers, etc., etc. But we've turned that into a very secular model, because first off, everybody you heal is going to die. They all die. Yeah, they love that. I've done a sermon in the church and just say, you're all going to die. And it's just, but it's true. But one of the problems of modernity is it doesn't give an account of suffering, except get rid of it, which is why always in modern ethics, the final answer is kill them. So we have abortion, we have euthanasia, we have basically that's the answer. You're done. Time's up. We don't want you to suffer. We love you so much. And I know you don't want to be a burden on your children. Oh, mercy, help us. And we call it mercy. Yeah? And that's very difficult since everybody is going to suffer. And to have a model of understanding the world that cannot give an account of suffering other than to say it's unfortunate, unwelcome, and a burden on the rest of us. There are no heroes in that. And so it's just a false image. And one of the things that's false about it is that money does solve a lot of problems. There's a whole bunch of suffering that having some money just really does nice things for, But it won't take the suffering away. I've buried the poorest of the poor. I've also buried billionaires. They were just alike. They were just alike. And the gospel speaks to the heart of that. Modernity doesn't. It's empty as a philosophy goes. But it will couch itself in ethical arguments because it'll make it sound like you're in favor of people suffering. Now, I'm not in favor of it, but I think there's not a lot you can do about it. I've written rather boldly and consistently that you cannot make the world a better place. I get a lot of pushback on that one, but it's a false ideology. You can do good things. Christians should do good things. But the ideology of making the world a better place was found on the lips of Joseph Stalin, was found on the lips of Adolf Hitler, because it's been the mantra of the greatest evils of the 20th century. In the name of making the world a better place, I'll eliminate your suffering. We'll just kill everybody in the Ukraine. Yeah, that was Stalin's plan. So this is not these building the better world. No. It's like, forgive me, making America great again. I say, couldn't we just make it good? Do not make a better world. Just try to be good. When I talk to college groups and they, what does God want me to do? I always say, He wants you to be a good person. That is, keep the commandments of Christ. Share your stuff. Forgive your enemies, love your neighbor, tell the truth. These very simple things. Do these things. He wants you to do that. and quit trying to make the world a better place. It'll make you anxious. It'll make you worried about things over which you have no control. It'll make you vote like a madman. Just craziness. It's craziness. Question another one.
I had a question posed to me by my friend Catherine here, talking about the next, and Catherine, you can correct me here if I'm getting it wrong, but basically the next stage, she read an article on a blog talking about the next stage of modernity being transhumanism, and basically the linking of human consciousness with artificial intelligence.
Well, I was basing that, kind of reacting to an article in a British magazine. Someone over there was sort of championing transhumanism. I mean, people have been watching Star Trek for way too long. I learned this once. I had, in my last Anglican church, I had a friend of mine who was a missionary in Nepal. That's pretty bold. And he came back and he was sharing, really good stories about people coming to faith in Jesus Christ in Nepal. And there was a young woman engineer in this large Sunday school class who, at the end of it, stood up and wanted to know what right he had to interfere with their culture. And I thought, wait a minute, that's the non-interference directive on Star Trek. That's the prime directive, right? You may not, and I thought, wait a minute, she's developed a moral principle from a science fiction television show. Surprise, surprise, the prime directive. You're violent. And I thought, what this is actually true is that the science fiction is modern theology. It just is. It is imagining the world in a way, and we've imagined, what on earth did they think they're doing wanting to send people to Mars? Everybody thinks that's a great idea. It's actually a really dumb idea. You can't live up there. In fact, nothing lives up there. It's really dangerous. There's like radiation between here and Mars that will kill you a lot. And why do we want to do that? We want colonies. What are you, an idiot? I'm so sorry. This is not a good idea. We can't even take care of the planet down here, and you want to go fix that place up. Gee whiz. Real estate is hard to get, but, this is insane. So, but it's based in a kind of theology of built out of that. So somehow or another, if anyone really wants the best angle in some ways on modernity, it's an old book written, I think, in about the 1940s. C.S. Lewis's, the third book in his science fiction trilogy called That Hideous Strength. And he just really unmasked the whole project. If it's transhuman is somehow what you want, then what is it that is that makes it better than just human? It's just silliness. So that you have it in your brain and you don't need to look at your Apple Watch or something. And quit watching so much television. Turn the things off and go out and live. This is, and it makes you miserable. So I shouldn't have to say these things. Your mother should. It's another question. Oh, gee. But it'll come up. They'll partly because there's a market for it. And, yeah.
What is a good translation of Gregory of Nyssa's Catechism?
I don't know. I don't know. Always a problem in reading anything with the Fathers is finding a decent translation. You get that 38-volume set of the Church Fathers. It was translated at Oxford in the late 19th century. And not only that, but it's complete with Protestant footnotes that think they can't possibly mean this, but anyway, that are there. And sometimes the translations are just bad. It's like reading the King James Bible. People do not realize how much politics there is in Bible translating. The word koinonia, depending on how you pronounce your Greek, koinonia, which means communion, Like in, let's see, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave, let's see, wait a minute. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, 1 John. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, then the blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin, and the King James says, and almost every Protestant translation says, and we have fellowship with one another. Jesus did not die for coffee hour. Okay? It's communion, and we have communion with one another. It's a theological word. It was also a word that Protestants don't like. Can you translate it fellowship? You could, because fellowship used to mean communion. It doesn't now. But, there's a lot of things in, translations out there that are very much theologically driven. And so, I think, and there's a lot of bad ones. And so I just have to confess, I read them in Greek and complain. Unhappy cat. So, yeah. Another one?
I think we are good for now. I'm getting the time's up from Sean.
Oh, yeah, there's that.
Thank you. That was a beautiful talk.